Man, when I first heard Rishi Sunak talk about Islam, I honestly didn't expect that kind of perspective. I've had hundreds of conversations on this podcast with politicians, philosophers, religious scholars, scientists, even regular people who've lived extraordinary lives. But this one genuinely caught me off guard. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. There was this calm intellectual depth and a surprising level of respect that you rarely see from world leaders when they talk about religion, especially Islam. I mean, let's be honest, in the media, whenever Islam comes up, there's usually some kind of pre-written narrative, either extreme criticism or shallow praise. Rarely do you get a conversation that's actually balanced, nuanced, and real. So when Rishi started talking, I was like, wait a second, this guy's actually thought about this. He wasn't just parroting political lines, he was diving deep into history, culture, and human behavior in a way that reminded me of some of the real thinkers I've had on this show. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is the Prime Minister of the UK, and he's talking about Islam like a philosopher, not a politician. He said something along the lines of how Islam has, throughout history, been a driving force for education, art, science, and moral discipline. And I just leaned back in my chair processing that because, man, politicians usually avoid that kind of talk. They stick to diplomatic fluff, but here he was straight up acknowledging Islam's intellectual legacy. And if you look back, it's actually true. Think about the Islamic Golden Age, man. Baghdad, Cordoba, Damascus, those weren't just cities. They were centers of innovation, science, mathematics, astronomy. People like Al-Khwarizmi, whose work literally led to modern algebra, the translation movements that preserved and advanced Greek philosophy, scholars debating astronomy centuries before Europe even caught up. And here's Rishi Sunak in 2025, calmly and intelligently pointing it all out, with genuine respect. That caught me off guard, man. I thought he was just going to do the typical political thing. We respect all religions, yada yada. But instead, he went deeper. He talked about how Islam influenced the development of structured governance, trade ethics, and intellectual discourse. That's heavy stuff for a sitting prime minister. And honestly, man, in the West, people don't talk about Islam like that. They either don't know or they just ignore it. So for him to bring that up on record, knowing the kind of backlash that can follow in politics, dude, that takes guts. But what really got me was when he connected it to modern society. He said something like, we have to recognize that the moral and intellectual contributions of Islam shaped not just the East, but the very foundations of modern Western civilization. I swear, I looked at Jamie and was like, did he just say that? Because that's the kind of line you usually hear from historians, not politicians. And it made me think about how divided our conversations have become. There's this tendency to paint entire groups with one brush. And here's this guy saying, no, let's actually look at the facts. That's refreshing. It's uncomfortable for some people, sure, but truth usually is. That's why this conversation stuck with me. I've interviewed people who either villainize or idealize Islam, but rarely someone who treats it with balanced intellectual honesty. That's what shocked me the most. He didn't sound rehearsed. He sounded like someone who had actually reflected deeply, and that made me want to dive even deeper into the subject. When someone in power talks like that, it sparks curiosity. It pushes people to rethink their biases, to question the narratives we're fed. You know what's even crazier, man? After that part of the conversation, my brain just started connecting dots. Because I've had scholars, historians, even controversial guests talk about religion, but very few actually highlight Islam's intellectual tradition without tiptoeing around it or framing it politically. Rishi didn't do that. Talk about Islam like it was some distant other. He spoke about it as an integral part of the human story, like it belongs to all of us. That hit me We live in a time where people love drawing lines, us versus them, East versus West, believer versus non-believer. History's way more blended than we think. He brought how Islamic scholars played a crucial role in transmitting ancient knowledge, refining it, challenging it, building upon it. He mentioned how universities in Europe were influenced by institutions like Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Azhar, places where knowledge was treated as sacred, not just practical. And he wasn't reading it off a card. He sounded like someone who had actually sat down with historians, maybe even read original sources. That made me pause because in Western politics, that kind of intellectual honesty is rare. Usually, religion is either a political weapon or a taboo topic. Here was a prime minister acknowledging Islam's role in shaping the intellectual DNA of the world we live in today. And I remember saying to Jamie, dude, can you imagine if more leaders talked like this? Not in a preachy way, but in a way that opens the door for deeper conversations. That's what I love about doing this podcast. It's not about taking sides. It's about exploring perspectives that mainstream conversations ignore. And Rishi, he just threw a curveball in the best way possible. He even touched on how the ethical frameworks in Islam influence trade and law, something most people completely overlook. Back in the day, Islamic traders had moral codes, guidelines that governed business across continents. These weren't just religious rituals. They were intellectual systems that allowed massive trade networks to flourish. That's why the Silk Road became such a big deal. Spices or silk being exchanged. It was ideas, philosophies, art, language, science. Islam wasn't isolated. It was a bridge. And Rishi acknowledged that. He said something like, we'll often talk about global trade like it's a modern thing, but centuries ago, Islamic civilization built networks of commerce grounded in trust, ethics, and curiosity. And I was like, holy, this guy gets it. He wasn't romanticizing, he was analyzing. That's the difference. And it made me realize how much modern society owes to that era. Modern banking, education, law, so much of it traces back to that history, but because of polarization, people either erase it or never learn it. Conversations like these are necessary. They remind us that civilizations don't grow in isolation. Knowledge isn't a monopoly. It's a relay race. One civilization passes the baton to another, builds on it, refines it, and Islam was one of the strongest runners in that race. And I was sitting there thinking, damn, if more people understood this, maybe we wouldn't have so many shallow, divisive debates. Instead of labeling, we'd be learning. Instead of fearing, we'd be exploring. That's what happens when a political leader chooses depth over slogans. It shakes the narrative. It forces people to stop and think. For a guy like Rishi Sunak to do that, it's bold. Because you know how the media works. They love sound bites, not substance. But he gave them substance. That's why this moment stuck with me. It didn't go viral for shock value. It went viral because it was real. What blew my mind, man, how he connected all this to today. Because most politicians keep religion and history locked in the past, like museum pieces. Interesting, but irrelevant. Rishi didn't do that. He said, some of the principles in Islamic teachings could guide modern ethical debates. He talked about how the emphasis on knowledge, discipline, and moral accountability in Islam isn't just ancient philosophy, it's timeless wisdom. And hearing that from a Western leader, today's world, that's rare. It wasn't PR, it was reflection. He said societies thrive when they value learning, when they promote debate, when they respect moral boundaries. And honestly, that applies to everyone, religious or not. He wasn't preaching Islam, he was acknowledging wisdom. And I respect that. Today, people think they're too modern to look back. But the truth, some of humanity's best ideas came from those civilizations. He talked about how scholars back then debated fiercely but respectfully. They weren't trying to cancel each other. They were trying to refine ideas. Imagine if we had that today. Instead of shouting matches, actual debates. Instead of polarization, curiosity. That's what he was hinting at. And you could tell he got the bigger picture. Then he said something powerful about justice. That one reason Islamic civilization lasted so long was because justice wasn't political, it was divine. That hit me, because when justice stands above politics, societies stabilize. And historically, that's true. Islamic empires thrived not because of wealth or power, but because knowledge and justice worked together. Judges were scholars. Scholars were respected. Knowledge was sacred. And honestly, that's a powerful idea, religious or not. He even mentioned how Muslim scholars preserved ancient texts, not for power, but for truth. They didn't just copy knowledge. They expanded it, argued with it, translated it, and handed it back better. That's legacy. That's impact. And when Rishi said that, I felt like he wasn't just talking about history. He was challenging modern society. Like, what are we doing with the knowledge we have now? Are we preserving it, expanding it, or just weaponizing it for short-term gain? That's a valid question. Because, yeah, we have more information than any generation before us. But are we wiser or just louder? That's why his comments stood out. It wasn't about glorifying the past. It was about learning from it. And I kept thinking, if we had more of these conversations in mainstream media, maybe people would stop viewing Islam through fear or politics and start seeing it through truth and intellect. There's a massive difference between ideology and history. And Rishi made that clear. Jamie and I just sat there afterward, off Mecca, and talked about how wild it is that something so intellectually grounded felt so radical. And that says a lot about where we are as a society today.